considered a lost decade in Latin America. You see, the average of the probability of a breakdown in Latin America is quite constant until 1970. Then it starts to go down. But from the mid-1980s increases the probability of a government removal, a presidential interruptions. And now, this ends in 2005. I think it would have flattened about at the highest level of Now, another way of seeing this is actually to say that democracy, as they did in the 80s, but then under harsh economic conditions, democracy is surviving its greatest tests. When is the democracy put to test? Well, when it's in peril, when there is a crisis. If it can survive the crisis, it means that it's all the more stronger. The weak democracies fall when tested. The stronger democracies, they actually survive when tested. So that's turning it all, looking at it from the other side. So it may actually mean that, well, they met with the same conditions as you had before a democratic breakdown, but the regime survived. They managed to handle it in some sort of way. It wasn't beautiful, but it worked. And for quite some time I've been quite sympathetic to that hypothesis. But of course recent incidents in Honduras and Ecuador put a great test on that hypothesis. At any rate, these events which I mentioned often are caused by protests in the street, mobilization by new social movements, and protests against, for instance, presidential scandals. They are, first of all, at least a sign of an increased control over government. And second of all, maybe a sign of increased form of populist participation. And that may be a problem, or that may not be a problem, depending on actually your political views. But I see still the early removal of governments or of presidents, I see that as a sign of at least increased accountability. Presidents are held to account for their actions. That might be a kind of vertical accountability from below, bottom up, reacting, public outrage reacting against scandals of corruption, which they maybe didn't do before, or which didn't come to the attention of people before due to lack of open media. Or it might be a sign of increased interinstitutional accountability. Congress or the court system actually holding a president to account for his or her actions, typically through an impeachment procedures. Now often these two, the vertical and horizontal, they interact. People in the streets protest and they get their legislator, you have to do something here, if not, we'll remove you instead. So there are some sorts of interactions. So, might still be a sign of crisis, but it's clearly an increased form of accountability also. Presidents live in greater peril of being removed today than they were earlier. It's not necessarily that the presidents today are more corrupt than they were earlier, or that they are worse than they were earlier, but they have a higher risk of not surviving their period, especially if they do something that is not legal, or not democratic, or that creates some stir in the public and can be used by the opposition to remove the president. So, accountability at least increases. Now in this debate on whether or not these interruptions are bad for democracy or good for democracy, my first take on this was, okay, let's relate this to the debate on whether presidentialism is good or presidentialism is bad. And because the hypothesis is that presidentialism cannot manage a crisis. There are no flexible features. The president cannot be removed before next election, so if you have a crisis, it will last until next election. And before that, the military will take over. And the impeachment is so difficult to use, so it's not practical at all. So my first take on this was, let's look at what they're actually doing. And it showed that basically what they're doing is not necessarily constitutional. They invent things as they come along, but it's at least flexible, and it's at least something other than a military takeover. And whether it's good or bad, I wouldn't say or wouldn't know necessarily, but at least it's civilian actors, and at least it's not a breakdown of democracy, and at least it's flexible, and they manage to get out of the crisis. So only in 3 cases there is a classical impeachment. In Brazil, corrupt president, Congress sat down, they investigated, and they went through a full impeachment procedure. So institutions worked as they were supposed to. In 2 cases you have resignation without any congressional action. I could say forced resignation, because it wasn't, presidents tend not to resign without any incentives. Of course, in Argentina there was a huge economic crisis, organized political protests, and a long transitional period between the election and the entrance of Carlos Menem. And Raúl Alfonsín decided to go early. So these are forced resignation. But most of them are Congress, pressed by public, finding out, looking through their constitution and finding excuses on how to make this relatively constitutional. So the most famous case, of course, is the case of Abdullah Bucaram in Ecuador, where they found out they can declare the president for mentally incapacitated, and they only need a majority vote to remove him. Much easier than the impeachment. The interesting thing about Ecuador is there's one or two countries where they actually could, because many countries have that clause, but most of them, they require doctors to sign up on that and do a medical check of the president for it to be used, but not so in Ecuador. So they used that, of course. But also, which I found out after a trip to Guatemala last year, I didn't know actually, was that Congress also voted the vice president of Serrano out of office. Because when Serrano was removed after the auto golpe, they sat down, okay, well, Espina was in on it, so we're voting him out. So they do these kinds of things. And in Bolivia, interestingly, at least for the ones who come from parliamentary regimes, the Bolivian president lost a vote of confidence. Carlos Mesa asked for support in Congress for the 2nd time that year, and the 2nd time he didn't get it. It's just what prime ministers do when they try to force an issue through Congress. So they invent these kind of things, and it doesn't always look beautiful. It's not necessarily very constitutional, but they invent some features there, then and there, that solves the crisis, and it ends with removal of president. We have other instances where it ended with also Congress going out, which has come as a trend later, but still. In some countries you get new and early elections, also a flexible procedure, not necessarily within the laws or the constitution. And you also have some transition elections that are part of the package when you remove it. So when Bucaram was out, it was dealt with then and there, we'll have a new election cycle. You reshuffle the political cards